Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Freely Nourished, the podcast that teaches you to break the cycle of dieting by empowering you to nourish your body well. I am your host, registered dietitian Erin Casey, and I am the owner of New You Nutrition Counseling, where we do exactly what we promise. We help you break free from the cycle of dieting by teaching you to nourish your body well in evidence based, sustainable ways that will last you a lifetime. So, if you are tired of diets and you are tired of the cycle of working really hard, and then falling off the wagon and then trying something new or trying something again, and you just want some sanity and something that is going to work for you long term, give us a call. All of our contact information will be in the comments below. And of course, you're welcome to follow us on our social media platforms. That kind of gives you a better idea of how we practice, what we preach, and how good nutrition can help you at reaching your health goals. So today, I want to talk, we're going off the beaten path a little bit. So we're going to stray away from nutrition just a tad for today's podcast to talk about something that I feel like is very important in terms of building sustainable habits, in terms of fixing issues with body image, and really kind of all of these mental games that get in the way of our ability to take care of ourselves and to nourish ourselves well. So to me, nourishment means that you are, of course, meeting your body's nutrient needs, but that you are also feeling satisfied with your meals, that you are also feeling as though you are free to eat what you want when you want. You're at liberty to go out to eat with friends and family, and you don't feel stressed about those types of events. You are also emotionally nourishing yourself well. You are taking physical rest when you need it. Those types of things, all of that comes into play when we start talking about changing our dietary habits, because as you can imagine, all of us have the behaviors that we have for a reason, right? They were either things that were taught to us, they are things that we picked up from a friend or a family member somewhere, they are things that we learned about on the media, but they're also there's patterns of our life, right? Like our schedule, for example, whether or not we choose to have children or a spouse. Things like that will certainly affect our eating habits, but also our mental health, which is kind of where we're sink our teeth in a little bit today. The Your mental health obviously has a huge drive on your ability to make and sustain behavior changes. So if changing your diet is something that you are interested in doing, it is really important to kind of check in and make sure the components of your mental health that affect behavior are well managed as well. Now, obviously, I am not a licensed counselor, so I cannot necessarily help you with that. But if you are looking for someone, there's certainly resources available to you. But if you're just kind of wanting kind of a mental check-in, kind of a surface level graze of it, I think this podcast may be really beneficial for you. Um, I have notes, but they're a little less detailed and a little less organized than my typical notes, and that's somewhat by design. I want to talk a little bit just kind of off the cuff and organically about some of these things with you, because I think they're certainly relevant to the work that I do, in the scope of behavior change and mental health, but I think they're also really pertinent to the world we live in today. And I think a lot of that messaging, I want it to just kind of come from the heart. So if I'm a little scattered, bear with me. If you're somebody who's just like, no, I need an organized podcast, then maybe skip this episode and it's not for you. But anyway, so diving right in. So judgment, right? Judgment is where we at a core level, we look at a behavior of ourselves or of someone else, and we place a moral value to it. So I'm going to say that again. Judgment, in a nutshell, is just looking at a behavior or an action of a person, of a group of people, of ourselves, and assigning a moral value to it. So a moral value meaning that is good, that is bad, that is evil, right? Or maybe it's neutral, but more or less we're kind of dividing things into categories: good, bad, right? And this is how we organize our world, right? Like this is kind of how our brains are inundated with signals all day long, and we start to categorize things, right? and sometimes it's not always just like as like good or bad. It's kind of like, category A versus like, for example, you look at a piece of fruit and you can tell me whether that is, you can judge whether that is a banana or an orange, right? Not that one of those is better than the other, but you can categorize them. But we do a lot of moral judging, and I think it goes a lot deeper than a lot of us realize. um, and I will say, I'll be frank, that a lot of this kind of has come about with some recent discussions with some extended family members, as well as my husband, who all of whom hail from Eastern Kentucky, which is kind of like the hills of Appalachia. And unfortunately, that area has been, I think, in a lot of ways, judged before it has been understood. I do not come from there, so I kind of can't really claim it as my own. But I will say that I think there's a lot of judgment of those type of people, that unfortunately are really not fair. And this came up in my own life just because if you are watching the news, at the time that I'm recording this, there has been some pretty significant flooding to the area of Appalachia. And I mean, it's just been devastating. It's been, people's entire homes, businesses, deaths, cars, all kinds of, I mean, just, it's destroyed. It's utterly destroyed. And people are currently in a pretty dire situation of, they don't have power, they don't have water, they don't have any way to get out and access food, medical supplies. If somebody had a medical emergency, most of the roads aren't clear enough to drive an ambulance. So, and honestly, there's very few places for the ambulances to go because hospitals have been destroyed too. So, just utter devastation. And I know that the audience for the audience that I tend to attract, right? They tend to be very loving and very compassionate humans because that's how I am. And I know that for what I'm about to say probably doesn't apply to anyone who is listening to this podcast. If it does, then you probably want to stop listening because you're probably not the right audience for this. But so unfortunately, there have been some posts on social media kind of along the lines of like, well, that's what Kentucky deserves for like voting in Mitch McConnell. And that's what happens when you're a bigoted redneck, like you got what you deserved, kind of things along that nature. And even if that were true, nobody deserves a disaster like that. Just hard stop. Nobody does. It doesn't matter what their political beliefs are, whether I agree with them or disagree with them. It doesn't matter. Nobody deserves that. Period. So to say things like that is utterly disgusting. And like I said, if you're somebody who believes that or has, kind of in alignment with that, then just stop listening now. We're not going to be friends. That said, I do think, kind of brought up a discussion with my husband that being kind of a hillbilly or a redneck is kind of the last kind of stereotypic, like, kind of the last stereotype that is allowable in today's world. And it's frustrating to him because a lot of the socioeconomic disparities that we tend to talk about in the Black community or the Hispanic community or just kind of other marginalized communities, all of those apply to Appalachia. It is probably one of the most devastatingly poor places in the world, but it's all white people, and that's just kind of the nature of it. And I won't say it's all white people. Like, yes, there are Black people there, but it's very few and far between. So they've kind of, they've suffered the same effects of poverty, but they don't get kind of lumped into that same category. So there's that, and then that's definitely true. And I think most people who work in states that have a sector of Appalachia being part of them, whether that's like Ohio or West Virginia, even Pennsylvania, the Carolinas, things like that, most of us recognize that very, very well, especially in the healthcare realm. We very, very often see, there's the level of, illness and acuity of that illness. So kind of how serious the illnesses are. So for example, diabetes is a very common illness amongst adults across the United States. So the incidence isn't probably really any higher in Appalachia than it is anywhere else. The difference is what we call the acuity or the severity. So because of the poverty and because of the geographical isolation, these people truly do not have the same access to medical care as even people who live in the same state, but have different circumstances. So For example, there are people who quite frankly are, given, they're supposed to say, let's say they're supposed to take 60 units of insulin per night to manage their diabetes. They can't afford how much insulin that is. So whatever that winds up being for a month, they can't afford it. So they spread it out. They don't take 60 units every single day. They take maybe 40 units every day to try to kind of space it out so they can go longer in between refills, and they're not out the same amount of cost. And unfortunately, as a result of that, their diabetes isn't being treated properly. It's just not. So they wind up, with a higher blood sugar on average, and that higher blood sugar on average can damage things like kidneys and hearts and eyeballs and things like that. So then you start to see these severe complications, all because they just quite simply couldn't afford a medication. And anybody who's had to take insulin will tell you that stuff's expensive. um, so even with good insurance, it's really, really expensive. um, so I think it's kind of, again, it's one of those things that, like, this happens. There's a large discussion in the medical community about why, there's poor health outcomes for, particularly Black Americans are kind of like the ones that's been talked about most, but certainly Hispanic as well. Really kind of all of these marginalized communities. And, the dialogue at one point in time as well, these people are somehow genetically different. We've since learned that that is racist as fuck to say, and incorrect. It has nothing to do with genetics. It has everything to do with poverty, as well as respect by the medical community. So very often, and I see this all the time, sadly, that people come in and assume that because people are in poor health is because they don't care about their health. And a lot of times it's just because they can't afford it, and they don't want to come into a clinic and be judged. Right. So sometimes they're avoiding doctor's visits, and they're not taking their insulin as prescribed. And the doctor just assumes that they're non-compliant, that they just don't care, when the reality is maybe they are scared to come into your clinic. Maybe they can't afford their insulin. Maybe they don't want to deal with the embarrassment of having to come into the clinic and tell you, hey, I can't afford this medication you gave me, so I can't manage my diabetes. Or maybe they just think, well, I can't do what you're going to tell me to do, so why even come? There's nothing you can do for me because my circumstances are not what you're prescribing. But and then it kind of just goes into this vicious cycle, right? The physician assumes that, okay, they're being non-compliant, and then they don't get the same quality of care because there's a bias now. And then it kind of just, the vicious cycle kind of starts to repeat itself, to where we wind up with a real divide. So those are the kinds of things I want to talk about today on kind of like a larger scale of kind of how we judge others and kind of the world around us, and then bring it into a smaller scale and how we judge ourselves, and how that then impacts our ability to affect change. So, like I said, we talked about health disparities, poverty, all of these things kind of with Appalachia. And there's a lot of assumptions made about Appalachians. There's a lot of assumptions of bigotry, of racism, and those things exist there. Do not get me wrong. Like, you will drive through the hills and you will see Confederate flags, and that, honestly, a lot of people don't think that that is a racist thing. I don't agree. I think that it is racist and they should not be flown. But a lot of people see it as a sign of like Southern pride. That all said, there is bigotry and there is transphobia and there is racism. All of that is present there, but all of that is present, like, up my street in my neighborhood too. So I think depending on where you live, that may be more or less true. I originally hail from kind of the Northeast, so where we're kind of, very more liberal, kind of very blue state type of thing. And Kentucky is definitely more red, but not all of Kentucky, right? So I think and even in, thinking of my parents who are of the baby boomer generation, who consider themselves to be very liberal and progressive, they're not. Like, my dad made a comment the other day about somebody having pink hair and a nose ring as a bartender, and it's just one of those things. Like it has nothing to do with who that person is as a person. Like, and I don't know, how this person identifies. I don't know if it was like male, female, cis, trans. Like none of that was disclosed to me. Just the simple fact that this person dyed their hair pink. Was a thing. It made my dad immediately respect that person less, even though they were doing their job perfectly well, and it had nothing. It had affected my dad in no way. It affected his interaction with this person theoretically in no way. So again, I think we have these kind of inbred biases, and it can be really uncomfortable to take a look at them and really unpack them. But I think once we do, it becomes very evident the ways in which we are judging ourselves, because I think by and large, the people who are listening to this podcast are going to take away from, we all judge other people, right? Like we just do, myself very much included in that. But when we do judge other people, a lot of times we are judging ourselves harsher. And it's also kind of a reflection of how we judge ourselves. So sometimes, for example, weight is a big one that I hear people talk about. It's they may not judge their friend based on their weight, but they judge themselves based on their weight. So, well, there's a little bit of fat bias there, right? There's a little bit of fat phobia there, right? And it's like it's one of those, well, it's okay for her to be overweight, but it's not okay for me to be overweight. So kind of any judgment, so if you take that and magnify it, right? So you may kind of look at yourself and be like, oh well, it's okay for that person to have pink hair, but it's not okay for me to have pink hair. If you're coming at it, it's not okay for that person to have pink hair, then what kind of pressure are you putting on yourself? I hope that makes sense. But I think one way that I heard this described, and it was by someone on TikTok, and I cannot for the life of me find who posted this. So if anybody finds them, please tag them in the comments below. I definitely want to give credit where credit is due. But anyway, this person said that there's two kind of main models for how we as humans look at morality or interpret morality. There's a vertical model and there's a horizontal model. The vertical model is I'm going to call it kind of more of a religious model. It doesn't necessarily have to be like Christianity or per se, but she used it in the context of Christianity. But basically, it is kind of like there's a higher being of some sort. It doesn't have to be God, but there's just kind of some higher power. And then humans are below that power. And kind of that higher power essentially wrote the rules for how those below the power, he, she, they, are supposed to live, right? So if you are Christian, so that would be kind of like, God and Jesus with it. And then, kind of like your 10 commandments. And if you're Jewish, it would be God. And, the 10 commandments, Jesus was just kind of a prophet. I don't know enough about Islam to intelligently speak to it, but I believe that, it's Allah. And then I don't quite remember what the Quran says about in terms of like commandment type things. But basically, every major religion has kind of some almighty power rule book, and then and then that's what we're supposed to, we as humans are meant to live to. And then there's a whole bunch of arguments about how that rule book is interpreted and whatnot, but that's not the point, right? The line of judgment goes higher being, rule book, and then you're judged based on your ability to follow those rules. So and you basically interpret morality as kind of the impact to you. So it's the impact of your actions will be either rewarded or punished based on that higher being. So again, nobody else is really relevant in this model. It's more of, other than the higher power, it's kind of between you and the higher powers, whatever you believe, that, and kind of this rule book as you interpret it. So, and then you are either rewarded or punished. Then there's also the horizontal model, which doesn't really involve much of a higher power. It's more you just base your perception of morality around the impact that your actions have on other people. So you really kind of take yourself out of it in this sense, and you are more basing it on, okay, how does what I do affect other people? And I think this is where we can kind of really sink our teeth into kind of some of the humanitarian efforts that are being made, certainly in kind of fighting for equality for people with marginalized identities, fighting for the rights of, women or people with uteruses um, to have rights to their own body. A lot of the language or kind of gendered language that we've become accustomed to that the trans community is kind of trying to fight against. I think that's where if we really think about it in terms of kind of this horizontal model, it becomes really helpful, because I hear a lot of arguments about like, well, why, that person, like, why is it wrong for me to assume their gender or something like that? Well, if you think about how that decision, that behavior of using gendered language impacts that person, then you can see how that might be harmful, right? Whereas if we use that vertical model, right, if it's, the almighty power, the rule book that doesn't say anything about gendered language, well, then by that model, you're not doing anything wrong. And I think in our fights for equality, we have to have kind of a more horizontal model, because basically that's what we look at ourselves as equal. We look at our needs as equal to those of our fellow humans, right? And I think that really thinking of morality in any other way, frankly, isn't going to get us very far when it comes to kind of treating people equally with dignity and with respect. Now, I'm not bashing the vertical model. I'm not bashing religion. I think it has its time and its place. But one thing that this one creator did say is that if you think of, that there's a power above you, and there may or may not be, right? Like for me personally, the jury's still out. That said, if that's what you believe, I totally respect that belief. But if you have the capacity to believe that someone is above you writing a rule book that you are then to follow, you also have the capacity to believe that people are below you too. And I think that is where we get very much in trouble when it comes to judging our fellow humans, right? So this kind of brings me back to the flood story and some of the nasty things I've seen on social media of, kind of people are making the claims that, so for example, lots of people have lost their entire homes, it's just quite literally washed away in the flood, or there's so much damage that, it's really not habitable at the moment. And I've seen things along the lines of like, well, if you had a job or if you had flood insurance, people in Appalachia don't have jobs, not because they don't want them, but because the industry is not there. Is there a drug problem there? Yes. Is there, people riding off of the government? Yes. But again, I could walk down my street and find people doing the exact same thing. It's not a problem unique to Appalachia. What's unique to Appalachia is that the main industries, one was tobacco, which was done away with in the early 2000s, and the other is coal, which is currently being done away with. And as someone who's very much pro earth, I want to see, I don't think coal is a good resource for us to be using. That said, the entire community there relies on coal. Those are kind of like the only sustainable jobs that don't involve significant amounts of time away from home and travel and things like that. Um, so when you think about taking that whole industry away, it becomes very scary for a lot of people, because then they have to either just leave the region entirely, which they're not leaving just, a house where they used to live. They're leaving their whole family, generations of their family who grew up there, who lived there, who worked those hills. Um, it's a hard thing to leave. And then also because of the judgment that's coming in, they don't trust outsiders, they don't trust people who aren't from there, which again I think can translate to other communities too. I know it certainly translates to the Black community and the Hispanic community. They don't trust white people, and they don't trust white people because white people have done them wrong, whether we've always meant to or not. We have. And it's just kind of one of those, they don't trust us, and they have no reason to trust us, right? They've built their own kind of insular communities of support based on the horrible things that white people have done to them over centuries. And frankly, Appalachia, even though it is white, has dealt with a lot of that as well. The government has taken away a lot from those areas and has not done anything to support their rebuilding. So I think there's room to understand and to level with each other on that. Um, And see, this is where I lost my notes. So I think again, that's where if you think about this vertical model, right? Whether it is Appalachians or Black people or trans people, whatever the case may be, if we think about it from this vertical model, right? It's easy to think, well, God made or whoever made it clear, it's in the rule book as interpreted by you, and I'm following the rules. So like I'm just following the rules. You're not following the rules, so you're less than, right? But the reality is, one, you have no idea if you interpreted the rules right or not. And number two, even if you did, even if you're following that one rule you're talking about, I'm guarantee you there's another one that you're breaking, because we're all human. We all, in Christianity, we call it sinning. In different religions, it's called different things. But, we all sin, right? Like, or we all break rules, right? And that's even assuming that we're able to properly interpret them, which of course is very debatable, right? So I think, it's very easy to consider other people as less than for really what are arbitrary reasons. You can thump your Bible and call it a commandment or whatever you want. You can find something somewhere, a verse somewhere that supports it. But the reality is that's another human being that lives a different life than you, and you are judging it as less than, plain and simple, right? Whereas on the horizontal model, we don't have that, right? It's just kind of I am making a behavior, I'm making a judgment, or I am making an assessment of this person. So I see this person who their house got washed away in the flood. That's so terrible. That doesn't directly impact me. So that doesn't make them a bad person, right? Like I feel for them. I feel empathy for them, but nothing they have done directly impacts me. Okay. And I don't want to hear it about like, oh, well, like they're draining the tax system and blah, 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 whatever. No, like that's not what's happening. That's quite simply incorrect. Nothing about federal relief is truly draining the tax system. Those programs actually get minimal amounts of money compared to things like the military. And honestly, if we taxed all Americans appropriately, those programs such as like food stamps, social security benefits, things like that could easily be tripled. Healthcare for all, those kinds of things, we can easily afford those things. We don't, because 90% of our government doesn't pay the taxes that they should. So I don't want to hear that argument. That is irrelevant. So I just kind of want to, close this up with, okay, we're talking about, these vertical models, the horizontal models, and how we judge other people. Now let's take a step inward and how we judge ourselves, right? So if people have the power to be higher than us, people have the power to be lower than us, then even within us, we're constantly striving for that next level or that higher level of what we should achieve. And that's not in and of itself a bad thing, right? That kind of holds our feet to the fire in a lot of cases. It makes us continually strive to do better, which in my opinion is not a bad thing. I don't think that is bad. What gets bad about it is when you hold yourself to such a standard that frankly you cannot achieve, or you're just like everybody else and you're fucking up the rules. Okay, you need to realize you're just like everybody else, because the reality is, to my knowledge, there is not a religion out there that preaches that there are gradations of humans, right? There is a higher being, and then there's a whole clump of the rest of us that are less than. And I'm not saying I agree with that. That's just from my understanding from the religions I've studied, that there's a higher power, and then there's us, right? But we want to kind of set ourselves away from that crowd. We want to kind of pick and claw and somehow be better in some small way than our next person, because I think we have this mindset that, in Christianity, it's heaven, but kind of whatever your afterlife kind of promise is from that being, it is, there's limited spots, right? So we want to make sure that we're doing all the things we can to get into one of those spots, because ultimately we're going to be judged based on our actions. Again, with the horizontal model, we just don't see that. We just don't see that judgment of ourselves in relation to others. It's just kind of like we're all on one even playing field, and how I am judged is how my actions affect others. So as long as nothing I am doing is causing harm to another human being, whether it is my thoughts, my words, my actions, then I'm good. right? And so long as another person's actions don't directly impact me. So, for example, if somebody is gay, that doesn't affect me. If somebody is trans, that doesn't affect me. If somebody is Black or Latin or, has a different experience and wants to speak to it, that doesn't affect me. Again, like I feel empathy for it or I can understand it, but, their existence is not harming mine. And likewise, I don't want mine to harm them. So the way I speak to them, the verbiage I choose to use, the ways in which I show up for them, and create safe spaces, those are things that I want to have a positive impact, not a negative one. Right. And again, I think that sets you up for a little bit of a kinder self judgment because, again, the only thing you have to do is kind of a do no harm effect, right? Is like the only thing, there's never you're not doing enough. As long as you're not causing harm, that's more or less okay. Is there more you can be doing? Sure, you can always create positive change. That's wonderful, but the goal ultimately is just not to create harm. um and there's learning and difficulty in that, but I think it comes easier to us. It's less competitive. And I want you to kind of sit with that, and I'll leave you with this: is kind of, what are the ways in which you are currently judging yourself, right? Um, it can be as your abilities as a parent. It can be, yourself on your weight loss journey, your ability to stick to the goals you've set for yourself. You can your job, how well you perform there, in your relationships, in your marriage. Kind of what judgments have you placed on yourself, and where did those judgments come from? So, like, what is the goal, and who told you that you should have that goal, right? um and if you are not able to achieve that goal, why not? What is getting in your way? And I think you will be amazed at the answers you will find. So that is it. Thank you so much for putting up with my prattling as of today. And as I've mentioned a couple of times on my social media accounts, my sister-in-law and I are teaming up to help provide some relief. I'm also working with both the Kentucky and Bluegrass Academies of Nutrition and Dietetics to collect supplies and things of that nature, for our friends affected by the flood. So if you would like to donate, I will put all of the information there. And if you want more information on kind of what some of the bigger organizations like the Red Cross and things like that are doing, I'll gladly put that information out there. It doesn't matter if it comes to me. It doesn't matter if it goes to them. Anything you were able to contribute, whether it is supplies, money, anything like that is really helpful at this particular moment. We're trying to quite literally dig people out of water, and it's been tough. So any contribution is truly appreciated by myself and others. And then of course, if you guys have, ideas, suggestions, questions about this podcast, I certainly would love to hear it. Leave me comments. Otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will talk to you next week.